Welcome to the Kitcar History File series, where we'll be going through the industry's past. We'll be visiting old marques of long ago, some modern ones, some mostly older stuff. A lot of archive information with photographs and information on the cars they made, the people involved, and what happened to them. Hi, welcome to the Total Kitcar YouTube channel. My name's Steve Hull, editor of TKC Magazine and Total Kitcar, and another episode of the Total Kitcar History Files follows very soon. If you're new around here, welcome, and if you're an old hand, welcome. In case you didn't know, this is 2024 and we're recording this, and we're in the 75th year of the existence of the UK's kit car industry, and that's quite a notable milestone, we think, and a great industry. And there's been some great marques, some great cars, some of which you may not even know of, or even knew were kit cars or whatever. And we're going to look at some great people and designers as well, of which there've been many. So this one's a notable one. This one's personally, for me, a very poignant one, because it's one of my favourite marques. The main man of the company was a guy that I got to know very well before his death, over the years until he passed away. The one and only Jem Marsh, and of course MARCOS. And it's particularly, I think, I don't need an excuse really to write or talk about MARCOS. It's a marque that I'm very passionate about. I know Chris Marsh, Jem's son, pretty well, and of course Roy McMath. Until recently part of MARCOS Heritage, all good guys, all very passionate about the marque, and as others are as well. And anyway, 2024, it's a pretty poignant year as well, because it marks 60 years since the car that really put them on the map, I suppose, and certainly was the one that etched in stone the MARCOS shape that we accept as being a MARCOS shape, shall we say. The MARCOS GT was first really sold as a product. Been launched in late '63 at a motor show, but it was productionised in '64. So it's only right, I think, that we cover that. But let's dive straight in here. Let's look at Jeremy George Weston Marsh, known to all and sundry as Jem. He was born on April the 15th, 1930 in Clifton, Bristol. And he had a wonderfully varied and colourful early life, which is pretty much descriptive of his later life, really. But he had a 9-year stint with the Royal Navy, actually, but he was discharged as a petty officer in 1955. And he gained very invaluable experience for his later life in electronics, welding, and even photography. I think he spent a stint as a photographer for the Navy. But anyway, his latest CV included he had a spell as a technical representative for Firestone tyres. He even sold combine harvesters for a little while, and this is the one that always made me chuckle. He was one of the performers for the marvellously called Hollywood Motor Maniacs and European Motor Rodeo troupe. An attempt, I think, an early attempt really at irony, as no one came from America, and they certainly never visited mainland Europe, and I don't think they had what we would call horses as part of the rodeo, but it was the motor rodeo. Anyway, he gained a great reputation, as well as an aside, as a 750 Formula racer, and he won many races and prizes. And he began building and driving his own specials, with his first car being an Austin 7, bought during shore leave in 1952, indeed. It was part built and took him 3 months to complete. And he told me once that it made him realise that he wasn't cut out for the Navy, which I thought was fabulous. He'd become properly involved. He first became properly involved with the automotive industry in the UK when he started Speedex Castings and Accessories in May 1957. Although, well, actually before that, he'd been involved with Robin Reed's Dante Engineering, DANTE, and like them, Speedex concentrated on making and supplying the specials builder of the day, of which there are many, with body shells and other bits and pieces. And he was quoted as saying he realised that tarting up an old Austin 7 was not going to bring him big profits, but it was a useful way of him gaining experience, and certainly provided him with a platform, an ideal platform from which he launched with another hero of mine, Frank Costin, MARCOS, 2 years later in 59. That Speedex range was actually quite good. I think he underplayed it quite a lot, really, and it included things like the 750 model, the Silverstone, and a thing called the Scirocco, SIROCCO, and they were all 4 Austin 7 chassis. And they offered a large range as well of conversion parts, uprated, go faster parts like cylinder heads, and their own label range of wheels, as many did. One of the attractions for him of the kit and special building industry in those days was that by constructing a car, or letting people construct a car at home, the swinging purchase tax of the day, which could be as high as 40%, could be avoided. But then when that was abolished, the industry, or the fledgling industry, took a hit, because overnight it was gone. So there was no real immediate attraction or benefit in building a car at home in 59, I think that was, when it was abolished. A Chancellor Exchequer of the day was a guy called Derek Heathcote Amory. I'm quite impressed I know that. And of course, 59 also was the year when the Mini and, of course, the Austin Healey Frog Eye Sprite came along. And I think it dawned on Jem that he had to, much like Peter Pellandine realised, he had to develop and change if he was going to survive in the industry. And he realised that Speedex wasn't going to survive. Fate, I think, took a real steer, and as it inevitably did with the greats of the industry in those days. A chance encounter in a pub at a branch meeting of the ubiquitous 750 Motor Club in Luton, and that's when he first met one Francis Costin, better known as Frank, of course, who was even then was a freelance designer of some note, but he hadn't long left the Havilland Aircraft Company, where he worked and learnt about wooden framed aircraft and aerodynamics, of course, and this would play a notable part in his future career. Jem told me that Frank was building, at the time he was building car bodies in Wales, and he suggested to him that they pool their talents really and should build a wooden motor car, or a wooden underpinned motor car. Frank had already, as I said, he was already pretty notable even in the late 50s, and he'd already designed stuff for Lotus, of course, and for Van Wall. And let's not forget, he was responsible for the highly acclaimed Lister Jaguar, better known as the Nobly. And that meeting, that chance encounter, was a good one for both men. They both needed a new challenge, and they got on really well too. Costin got set about putting his aviation design skills to good use, and he came up with a lightweight wooden laminate monocoque body structure for what he called a GT car, powered by a 100E side valve engine named, I think the car was named Xylon, which could well be Greek for wood, I think, or ancient Greek for wood. Frank was always more interested in how a car performed or worked rather than how it looked, and I think that's a criticism that's been levelled at him, I suppose, over the years. But he was steadfast in his belief in that was the way to go. Aerodynamics was important. Trends changed, as he said, but the wind didn't. So he was, as I say, redoubtably, he would protect his designs quite proactively. He wouldn't sort of listen to it if anyone had said that, criticise his cars. He'd listen, but he would stick to his guns. Anyway, so the Xylon, quickly nicknamed the Ugly Duckling, was a fantastic handling car. I think 9 of those were sold. A chap called Bill Moss proved its ability. He did 9 races in, I think, 1960, maybe 59, and he won all 9. and that car was fast and streamlined, and was for its day very advanced. And it certainly proved the viability of and merits of using wood over metal. Lots of people probably ultimately didn't really get a car underpinned by timber, but those that did, they did, and it certainly proved itself. The company, the model was called a MARCOS, but at that time the company name they'd settled on was the Monocoque Body Chassis Company Limited, MBC. There's no real mystery about how the dimensions for the car were settled on. Jem was a lanky lad at 6'4", and like many others have done since, he sat on the floor and basically just sat on a piece of plywood and just drew around it. An employee, I think his guy name was Graham Coombs, he drew the chalk outline around him. And later in 1960, the men that became synonymous with the classic sort of MARCOS shape, the Adams brothers, designer Dennis and engineer Peter, arrived. Dennis had been in the RAF and was working for Brian Lister at the same time that Frank was designing Nobly, and they'd both been impressed by each other, I think, at the time. And Frank was certainly pleased to see the arrival of Dennis at the MBC. And they joined him in his workshop in. I'm gonna struggle with this pronunciation, and forgive me anyone listening in North Wales or Wales in general. Dolgellau, Dolgellau. Sorry about that. My South London accent has butchered that, I feel certain, but apologies. But you know what I mean. Anyway, Jem stayed in Luton, and he was still trying at that time to keep Speedex afloat, but to no avail really. The company had sold, by 1960, they'd sold 6 cars when one pre-knighted Jackie Stewart got involved and interested in what MARCOS or what the MBC were doing. And other drivers of the day, like a chap called Gordon Jones and notably Jackie Oliver, later Formula 1 driver too, they all cut their teeth behind the wheel of a MARCOS. When Dennis had made some modifications to Frank's Ugly Duckling Xylon, Frank, I think that's probably fair to say, threw his dummy out. Yeah, so Frank had got quite upset that some changes had been made to the Xylon that he didn't agree with. The nose cone had been changed and it got new gull wing doors. And that became they moved back to sort of Luton area, the Adams, and with Jem, and that became known as the Luton Gull Wing in 1962. And I think 13 of those were sold. And I think Jem told me once that he realised at that time that it wasn't just a group of mates pooling their resources to mess around with cars. He became aware that it had the makings of a proper car manufacturing operation, and so it proved indeed. Early 62, he'd finally shut the doors of Speedex for good, and there was inevitable knock-on effects for the Monocoque Body Company. The Adams brothers moved back off to Audley End, where they came from in Cambridgeshire, right by the side of what's now the M11 near Duxford, actually. And Jem went to work for a time for Leslie Bellamy's LMB company in Guildford. And he was particularly responsible for Leslie's Debonair model. Although Jem was pretty forthright in his view on the Debonair, and it was his behest it was pulled. Several factors really, mainly because he reckoned it was too heavy and it was far too expensive. But then at this time, impeccable timing, a saviour for Jem in the form of Lieutenant Commander Greville Cavendish appeared, a chap with a passion for cars, and interesting cars at that. And he expressed an interest in resurrecting what was the MBC company, and funded new premises in Wiltshire, Bradford upon Avon, which previously housed the Royal Enfield Motorcycle Works, no less. This is where he lived, indeed. Not the motorcycle works, but he lived in Bradford upon Avon. And the car was modified. The original Luton Gullwing was modified again by Dennis to create what was called the Fastback in 1963, and they sold 18 of them. And Cavendish, or Marcos, the company became Marcos Cars Limited at this time, and they now officially existed. And I think Cavendish remained involved until 65 when he retired, although he is a key, if not often recognised or certainly understated, cog in the Marcos history. If he hadn't provided that funding and convinced Jem to carry on with the Marcos way, offering him encouragement, we probably wouldn't have seen, or there's a good chance we wouldn't have seen Marcos develop the way it did. And then, of course, in late 1963 at the motor show came the car that became synonymous with the Marcos shape and the Marcos way, shall we say, was the Marcos GT, instantly recognisable. And it was a Volvo engine, 1800, with the wooden chassis, and that car met with much critical acclaim. So it was quite slow to begin with. And it was priced at 1,500 quid, and I think it might scare a few people off. And I also because of the fact that wood and the timber chassis, although in my view and many others was fantastic, or is fantastic indeed, I think lots of potential customers just couldn't get their head around the fact that a car could possibly, in 1961, or 63, could have a wooden chassis. The initial, or probably the obvious power plants for that car were from the Essex Marque, some toy box. Although Jem didn't really like the Boy Racer, although he reckoned it was also a bit heavy, the engines that were available to him from Ford. Although he did eventually succumb, and he used a 1500 pre-crossflow from the Cortina GT, I think. And he liked that engine because he's quoted as saying that the last Ford had begun to manufacture engines that were suitable for the type of car that he was producing. That was a good engine. That was a five bearing 1500cc engine, and it was, as I say, fitted to the GT, and it helped to reduce the costings that for a manufacturer of the day was presented with. And of course, it was less of a servicing problem to the customers because more people of that time knew about a Ford engine than they did about a Volvo. And I think between 64 and 66, when the wooden chassis gave way, along with the Volvo engine, gave way to the Ford and a metal chassis, I think about 100 of those were sold. 66 came the 1500, as we said, and that lasted till 67. Oh, sorry, beg your pardon. First, the initial ones, Ford engine 1500 GT, had the wooden chassis, and about 100 of those were sold too. In between that, we had, or just after that, we had a 1650 GT. Now, that was an interesting one. That was Jem's acquaintance, Chris Lawrence, later, another automotive hero of mine, who known for the Deep Sanderson and the moniker and many other things, and certainly an association on the racetrack with Morgan. He was running a company called Lawrence Tune, and he had a nice line in tuning those 1500s into a 1650 unit, and in 67 Jem sold a run of 20 of them. Then came the Crossflow powered GT, still with a wooden chassis. That between 67 and 69, 200 of those were sold. And then we saw a sort of step sideways, shall we say, in the form of the MARCOS XP, or the XP Mantis, I should say. Now that's a very interesting vehicle, only a one-off, designed as to show, I think, what they could really do. Dennis Adams came up with the remarkable body shape for the, well, it's often called the XP Mantis and also the Mantis XP. I think probably 1968 is possibly more accurate for when that came out. I think for a while Jem had notions of taking on Ferrari and Ford at Le Mans. So he came up with the radical shaped Mantis. It never saw the track actually, but it's gone down in folklore as a one-off wonder, I think. Mid-engined fiberglass body, or glass fiber body I should say, over a stressed plywood chassis with a steel tube front and rear subframes and two twin side mounted fuel tanks. Excuse me. It was a futuristic and designed to be attention grabbing, with sharp angles all over it. And a perspex roof, I seem to remember. And that continued through to the rear of the car, where the mid-mounted 3-litre Brabham Repco 740 or 740 V8, which Jem, actually I always thought it was a myth and it was never confirmed, but he did tell me, he did actually confirm that he bought it off of Jack Brabham, or the pre-knighted Sir Jack Brabham, over a Chinese meal. After he tried to buy a BRM V12 for the car, it fallen through. I think he had a Hewland transaxle, GG300 if I'm right, and a complete set of John Cooper's or Cooper F1 car all-round independent suspension was purchased from John Cooper to complete the build. And it was quite a task, I think, to get it out of the Bradford upon Avon workshop. It did race once, actually. Sorry, I said earlier on I made a mistake. It did actually race once. It was too late. It finished too late to get to Le Mans for test days, and it had one outing on track at Spa in May 1968. And I can't remember who the original driver was intended to be, but he dropped out. And leaving Jem, as I said earlier, a very handy peddler, but he had to pull all the seats out and to get his 6'4" into it. Torrential rain was also a hazard that day, and I think the car began to fill up with water, although they hastily drilled some holes in the floor. Excuse me, and due to the rain, though, the alternator became wet and it developed a really serious misfire, which again Jem couldn't afford to blow that engine up, so sensibly he withdrew the car, retired the car after just 13 laps. He stuck when he got it back to the UK. The Repco Brabham engine that went and replaced by a Buick V8, which I think was obviously the forerunner of the Rover V8, and I think Jem used the car on the public highway. I think he was driving it around Bradford upon Avon until Customs and Excise began chasing him for payment of purchase tax. I think he exported it. He got out of it by exporting the car, and it went off to America, where it still lives to this day. Excuse me. It did come back actually for the MARCOS anniversary 50th anniversary in 2009. Shelsley Walsh, I think that was. No, not Shelsley Walsh. No. Prescott. Forgive me. And the car was shipped over. What a remarkable car that is, and it still looks $1 million. It still looks $1 million to me today. Incredible machine. But anyway, that aside, there was just one of those, 68. They continued. They I think, buckling to demands really. They wanted people wanted more power from the GT. There was a 3-litre V6, the Essex V6 3-litre. Installed in that car, 1969 to 1971, probably sold about 120 of them. Then they gave up the wood and introduced a metal space frame chassis, same engine, nearly 200 I think of those. They retained the V6, as I said. There was also a V4 which Jem disliked with a passion. Same period, 69, 71, metal chassis. Maybe 78 was sold, and he was quite adamant that it was the wrong engine for the wrong car. Great for a transit van, but not good for a sports car. Not one of his favourites. That there was also a Volvo 3-litre for the American market. The Volvo made I think it was the B30 engine, 1969. And they sent 172 of those stateside. I think most of them went stateside anyway. And then there was another interesting Dennis Adams sidestep in the form of the Mantis M70. Second use of the Mantis name, although it wasn't connected in any way to the original 2 years before. Now, Jem saw this as being an executive's GT for traversing Europe for business meetings in comfort. Firmly believed in that car. Others didn't. They didn't really see it as being a proper MARCOS, but it was certainly a very good car. It was well built, and of course, they put all their efforts into it. Just didn't capture people's imagination. Fitted with a Triumph 2.5 litre straight six from the TR6, I think. But it was a very labour-intensive car, I seem to remember. But people after 32 was sold, it was withdrawn. But kitcar aficionados might remember in the 80s, mid-80s, it came back as the auto-tune Mirage when Jem's friends Anthony and Carolyn Taylor acquired the project. Going back to the stateside company, I think a test of in Motor Magazine had attracted the attention of lots of overseas customers, and there was inquiry from a chap called Jeremy Foster-Fell, and so Jem took a trip to the USA with his company accountant Robin Buchanan to visit Foster-Fell, and they liked what they saw, and that's when they developed the Volvo B30. At that time, even though the company was very busy, Jem still found time to qualify for his private pilot's license, aircraft license. I think by that time they'd sold to 16 countries around the world. Business was booming in the UK, and Foster-Fell had put in orders or projected orders for £250,000, a considerable amount of money. And if I go on to Money Sorter inflation tracker, that tells me that's 2.7 million today. So they were really in a good place and looking set fair. They'd even outgrown the premises in Bradford upon Avon. And as Jem told me, probably in 2005-06, he was employing about 111 men. And they were building 7 cars a week in an old mill with 7 stories and various outbuildings. And as he said, the time had come, they had to move. They knew it had to be the correct premises. They didn't want to be shed hopping, as Jem said. So they wanted to also secure the future of the company. And they fully expected to continue that. Jem left would leave no one in any doubt. It was a serious operation, and one that was looking really, really stable. He had fellow directors, a guy called Roger Shutter and also Nick Harrison, and they decided that they should really take their time on this. And they visited other manufacturers. Shutter and Marsh went to visit, or Shooter and Marsh went, I think his name's Shooter, really, forgive me. Went to visit all sorts of companies like Ferrari, Lotus, Reliant and Jensen, just to see how they did things in their factories. And of course, Jem probably used it as a bit of industrial espionage as well at the same time. And then until they found a new factory or a collection of buildings in Engineer Road in Westbury in Wiltshire, where they got the capacity up to 15 cars a week initially, and that rose to 30 by 1971. Although there was disaster looming. A batch of those US spec GTs with the Volvo engines were held at the docks in America by customs, and it caused, they were there for over a month, I think, and they just couldn't get them out. And the US company collapsed, and that left MARCOS £30,000 out of pocket, which is about 345 grand. That's the value of those cars that were impounded. And that was the value of that consignment. And if you add that to the year, that was the year also 73, where VAT was introduced, and it was inevitable really that they were going to suffer, and it caused serious concerns for the future of the company. Jem did gain some investment from a company called Hebron and Medlock, Bath Engineering, who, although within 6 months they'd gone into receivership too. And that was really the end of chapter 1 for Jem. Rob Walker Group, which was at that time owned by the Mini Sprint and Opus gentleman called Jeff Thomas, a real gent, he purchased all the remaining stock and assets. But it was 1972, not 73, with Jem at the age of 42, with a couple of £100 in his pocket, devastated by the collapse of the company. But he still was always redoubtable, never afraid of a challenge. He had a lot of determination, and he set up a spares and restoration company dedicated to MARCOS owners. So if he couldn't supply them with a car, he could supply them all the parts that they needed. And indeed, and Rory joined him, Rory McMath, and Chris as well, young Chris, his son. And they did really well at that. They did really well, and in fact, they were so successful at that. Jem bought Datsun, now known as Nissan, of course, car dealership, and also I think a Lancia one in the Wiltshire area. He really was an amazing chap, old Jem. Nothing would keep him down. So much so that by 76 he'd reacquired the MARCOS name. And again, he was doing okay. He was doing really well. He didn't get back into manufacturing initially, but he had got the name, and he got the moulds back from the Walker Group. And by 1981, he got the capital he needed to start thinking about remanufacturing his beloved MARCOSes again. First model, he launched in kit form he called it a 3-litre kit, and I guess because it was a GT, but it wasn't a specific one. It looked like the 3-litre, the original 3-litre GT kit in terms of the body shape and stuff, but he was quite happy for other engines to be used. So some of those, I think about 130 of those were produced between 1982 and 1990, I think. And Essex V6, Cologne V6 at 2.9, Ford 2-litre, Triumph 2.5 litre, Ford Pinto. I think even a couple had the V4, the engine that Jem didn't like. I think they had one of those too. So I think, of course, we also I think we stepped up before the end the first end in 72. They'd also produced a 2.5 GT, 1971 only, with 12 were sold, and then there was an economy version of the 1600 GT. Although that didn't really prove to be, I think that was seen as a way to get money in, but it didn't really work, and only 6 of those were sold before it all went a little bit pear-shaped. And they started off really well. They were gaining, if not quite as buoyant as they were when they stopped in 71, 72. The people were just happy to see the MARCOS mark back again. And it was going good. I think Dennis Adams had a little look at the old GT for what I called the 3-litre kit, and he kind of revised it as he would. And it showed that there was still a demand for the Marque's products as well. 1984, a very significant move that turned MARCOS into an exotic specialist manufacturer, I suppose, was made with the launch of another, I guess, if not as important as the GT in MARCOS history, not far behind it, and the Manula, which people have speculated as to that name, but as MARCOS aficionados know, it's just merely a conflation of the word mantis and tarantula, which I think is quite good. And that was Inspired Step. That came along in 1984. They rode with V8 power. And it was, if ever an engine was suited, or ever that engine was suited to a car, it was the Manula. If you've ever driven one of them, I mean, a GT is a lovely thing, but if you've ever driven a MARCOS Manula, you'll know what an absolute peach it really is. Weight distribution, I think, is perfect at 50-50. It's got beautiful balance. It does everything well. And I remember soon after he launched the Manula Spider, the open top version in the mid-80s, I worked at that time for a magazine called Kitcars and Specials, and we used to sponsor what became quite a well-known event on the Kitcar calendar in the UK, the Action Day, or the Action Days, initially at Castle Combe, although we also did them at, we did one at Mallory Park and one at Knock Hill in Scotland. In their original form, they were organised by Stephen Roberts of Merlin Motorsport, and our magazine sponsored them, and they were great days. They were good days. They continued, or they carried on, or they were resurrected in the 90s, but they were never quite the same, I don't think. But back in those days, they were great. And anyway, a couple of things spring to mind about that. I walked up to Jem one day, because what would happen was on the Friday, Saturday was a public day. On the Friday, we had a private day where our magazine, as we sponsored it, we'd send some journalists along. The manufacturers were quite happy to turn up. They were going to turn up on Friday afternoon, so they happily turned up on Friday morning to allow us to drive their cars around a deserted circuit. You know, brilliant days. And that worked really well. So our editor at the time, Martin Foster, he gave us all a clipboard with a amount of cars on it that we were expected to drive and give our feedback and driving impressions of, and that was great. And on mine was the MARCOS Manula Spider. And I remember walking up to Jem. I'd met him the year before. I think I first met him in 85. This would have been 86, I'm almost certain. Anyway, I walked up to him as a young lad the other day, going back 40 years, for goodness sake, 38 years. And I said, "Oh, Jem, your car's on my clipboard. Can I have a go in it?" And that's definitely not the right way to approach Jem Marsh. And certainly using the word "can I have a go" in your car didn't impress him. And he looked at me. I had long hair and spots then, and he looked me up and down and said, "You've got to be a man to drive my car, sunshine," which was absolutely devastating, because he did it in front of people. Yeah. And to a young me who had a bit of an ego, bigger than him, bigger than myself, it was deflating, to say the least. But in hindsight, I look at it and I just roll up laughing when I think about it. But another thing that I remember was that Jem in that Manula Spider, it looked like he was cruising around Castle Combe. But I remember trying to catch him in something that I thought was quite quick, because I wanted to pay him back. I wanted to show him that I was a proper driver. And I think I might have been in the Caterham 7, a twin cam one. And I was going what could have been a motor speed magic. And I was nipping along the track, doing taking probably all the wrong lines. But I was hanging around. I mean, they were fast cars for that day. Certainly compared to my company Ford Escort 1.3. Mark III Escort, and I just couldn't catch him. I saw him in the distance, and it was almost like he had his arm. He didn't, but it was almost like he had his arm up on the window, one-handed. I think it showed what a great driver he still was, and definitely what a great car the Manula is and was and is. But those thoughts have never left me, really. But anyway, so the Manula in its coupe form between 1983 and 1992. Probably 170 of those sold, and I think the Manula, according to Rory, between 85 and 92, about 120 of those. 1991, he bought out what was called the Martina. And the Tina part of that, well, Mar from Marcos and the Tina was from Cortina. Again, was a kit. It was again intended as a budget offering actually, and the engines that were designated to that was the Pinto 1600, the Cologne 3 litre, I think, and anything else within reason, I think, was Jem's view. Available between 91 and 94, Spider and Coupe. Jem looked back on it with regret. He thought they missed the mark. They shouldn't have done it. Along with the GT V4, I think he saw it as a bit of a failure. It still sold 80 of them, but he didn't. Again, I don't think Jem had standards, and he kind of knew what he wanted to achieve, and he certainly knew what he didn't want. And in hindsight, I think he didn't want the Martina, I should say. Beg your pardon. Took a drink. The next notable, real notable Marcos, and one that he was very happy with, was the Mantara. And that superseded, that did actually supersede both Mantulas. It looked quite similar to the Mantula. If you look at one, they look quite similar. But there was intensive detail development on that car, and almost every part, I think, had been replaced, including the engine, which was now, although still Rover V8, was a 3.9, and that took power to 198, just short of 200, or there was an option, I think it was the NCK Sports Pack, which I think was 240, or depending on who Jem was talking to, he claimed 300 if he was feeling mischievous, I think. And then of course we really got in that Rover V8, or you could have the Rover Tomcat in that car. That was a good engine, and you could fit one of those if you wanted to. Then we get into some of the some real serious racers, I think. And by this time, Philip Hume of the Computer Centre, the very successful Computer Centre operation, was a lifelong. He realised a lifelong ambition. In 1990, he owned a Marcos. He bought a Marcos. And in another Victor Kiam moment, Remington, he liked the company so much he bought it. And it was with his support and enthusiasm that Marcos was able to develop those GT racers, the LMs, shall we say, and indeed culminating in their marvellous victory at Le Mans. So the first one of those was the LM200. That was Tomcat powered, 1994, just one of those. Then we had the LM400, which was much better suited in Jem's view, between 94 and 98. That had a Rover V8 4 litre, or in LM500 form, the V8 5 litre. And I think around 30 of those combined were sold. They were road cars. They could be used on track, obviously, but they were particularly road cars. The LM500 Racer of 1994, that had a 5 litre, 7 of them. And then we had the LM600 of 1995, which featured an LS, I think it might have been LS1, GM LS1 V8, brilliant engine, 4 of those. And I think that was the car. That was the car that obviously had scored the victory at Le Mans. We'll cover the Mini Marcos briefly at the end of this. It kind of is obviously a Marcos, but we need just to keep it slightly separate, so I'll cover that in a second. That was reintroduced in 1991, by the way. And around about that time, early 90s, Jem felt really confident. He had a model that, for all pockets, he had for tastes, and if you wanted to go on track, he now had something to offer you. With Philip Hume's support, he could offer you a race car. Kit stopped in 1993. Incidentally, they kind of wanted to be seen as a fully fledged specialist low volume car manufacturer. Jem remained at the helm with Philip Hume, and Marty's son Chris taking having a bigger say in the company's running. export sales were going well again as well. And so much so, the Manta Ray arrived in 1997, and that was a cool thing. Now, that was designed by Lee Adams, effectively a restyled Mantara, I guess, but a nicely, tastefully restyled Mantara. Similar chassis to the Mantis. Well, sorry, to that car, but with Rover V8. And Lee, of course, was Peter Adams' son, Dennis's nephew. Now, the racing exploits and successes and the resulting European sales success had brought MARCOS to the attention of the Belgian firm Eurotech, who were race prep and engineering. And they bought a majority stake of the company, I think, in 1999. Incidentally, the Manta Ray, you could, as well as the Rover V8, you could have Tomcat, the turbo one, and the normally aspirated one in one of those between 1997 and 1999. And I think 26 of those might have found homes. Then came a third incarnation of the Mantis, 1997 to 2002. Now that had the modular Ford Mustang, the V8 4.6 engine, and maybe 50 of those sold, and as well as the 38 cars that were built for the Mantis Challenge, a one-make race series between 98 and 99. But sadly, I think it was late 2000 or late 1999 into 2000 when, despite the successes they'd had, Eurotech had become disillusioned with the road car side of the business. Prices were rocketing, customer demand had dropped, and investment had, and sadly they ceased trading once more. I think it was late 2001, maybe late 2000. But all was not lost. You wouldn't expect it to be. Well, it was not, at least for existing owners, though, as excuse me a minute, a second there, tickly cough. Roy McMath, a while MARCOS employee, had set up MARCOS Heritage operation, and he acquired the rights and moulds to most of the old models, I think all of them. The man that knows everything about MARCOS, and he can quote part numbers and everything that you could ever think would be associated with those cars over that 30-year period. That's 40-year period at that time. Roy was your man. And he could supply, and his company, MARCOS Heritage, he's recently retired, but he's still involved as an advisor. I think they can supply parts all the way back to 1959. And then, of course, Jem wasn't done. He set up MARCOS International in 2001. And it took him a little while, but he came back once again, and again with Rory's help. For the third time in his career, he rose phoenix-like and relaunched the MARCOS brand with what was an exciting new car called the Marcosite, a semi-precious metal, incidentally. The Marcosite 250 TS. In reality, it was a revamped Manta Ray, with the revisions done by Lee Adams again. Although this time the I think power came from Ford Eurotech V6. Although it developed incrementally into the TS200. I think the first one was a 200 actually, with a Eurotech's 4-cylinder engine, one of them. But then he quickly, in fact, I drove that car, the 4-cylinder one. Then it quickly morphed into the 250, the Eurotech V6, 2.5 litre, and 5 of them were sold. And finally, a revisit of the Mustang-powered 5 litre car, the TS500. I think a couple of those were sold. This brought Jem to the attention of American businessman Tony Stelliger, the late Tony Stelliger, in 2003, and he bought into the company, ultimately taking it over. And they moved to a new operation to a new base in Kenilworth, Warwickshire. And a subsequent array of new models appeared. all under really the TSO banner in various incarnations. So the first one was the TSO Roadster, GM LS1 V8 powered. I think that gave 355 that horsepower. That came along in 2004. Then we had the TSO GT in 350 and 400 guises, again LS1 powered. Then came the TSO GT2 coupe car. I think that had a Corvette engine, V8 from the Z06 or Z06 Corvette. That had 475. That was a real headbanger, that one. Then we had the TSO GTC of 2006, another coupe. You could have that as the 420 standard or a 460 performance model. I'm not sure how many of those were made. And then finally there was the TSO R/Track, which I think stood for road and track combination. Again, LS1, 355 horsepower. And those cars were designed by ex-TVR man, Damien McTaggart, in fact. And with technical input from ProDrive, again, looks set fair. Jem was no longer involved. He was an advisor, but Rory certainly was, Rory McMath. I think maybe prices initially started at 50,000, but soon risen to 66. And by late 2007, early 2008, Tony Steliger had shut the operation down. And I think they might have only made 15 cars, maybe 14, 15. And that possibly, sadly, was the last we saw of the MARCOS marque. Although Rory's company could still offer, or can still offer you a Mark 6 version of the Mini MARCOS under the MARCOS Heritage name, or the Heritage Mark 6 name. We'll just quickly touch on the Mini MARCOS shortly, but I always kept in touch with Jem until he passed away, in fact, in Ace 84, March the 2nd, 2015. And he remained a larger-than-life character until the end. Going out for lunch with him a couple of times in his Bradford-upon-Avon home with his wife Lynn was always interesting, because he'd often bump into some of his old workers, and it was quite interesting and fascinating him hearing the banter between them. And he'd always phone me up if I said something that he didn't like, or I'd covered a car he didn't like. He'd regularly phone me up to berate me about something or other, as I'd always send him a copy of the mag after he demanded to be put on the free subscription list, bless him. The one thing that always remained with me, though, was, I think it was September 2014, and every time I phoned him a mag, he'd phone me up for a chat next day. And this one really has stuck with me ever since, really, and it still gives me a little bit of a choke in my throat, even now, really. He'd always say, "Hello, is that you, Hull?" That'd be his opening gambit. "Well, thanks for the latest issue, your magazine you sent me. You've got it all sorted out now, haven't you? It's brilliant." Now, from Jem, that was the biggest compliment that I could ever expect to have. And it, as I say, it stuck with me ever since. He'd always sort of give you a sort of a backhanded compliment, perhaps. But that one stayed with me ever since, really. He'd never given me a direct compliment before, and I'll take that from such a luminary like him. And on reflection, I mean, there's no doubt, really, Jem belongs right up there with the greats of the British motor industry. And I think he should be regarded in the same hallowed terms as people like Colin Chapman for the impact that he had on the industry. He was a maverick like most of the others of his day. He liked that, by the way. He relished that title. And everybody I knew who knew him well, they have their own batch of often hilarious, often scurrilous Jem Marsh stories. And his son Chris, he's got some brilliant ones. And there are so many he's told me I couldn't really print some of them. But truth be told, when Jem was around, or Jem's memory, we often end up with laughter, or laughter always follows. And his was a wonderful story. It was an incredible career story. One of resilience and determination and belief. And although I suppose people thought he was a control freak and he was a boss who found it hard to delegate, it wasn't really the case, because he as back in that pre-crash period of the late 60s when the company was growing fast, Jem, he would happily delegate without question to Nick Harrison and Roger Shooter. Although he was a very skillful operator and managing a small, he understood specialist sports cars implicitly, and that's has always been, I think, one of the hardest nails or nuts to crack over the years for various people. And I always remember him fondly. It always makes me smile. And he was a lovely chap, and I really enjoyed his company. He's much missed. But let's quickly go on to the Mini Marcos. Jem was involved initially with Dizzy Adicott of the DART concept that subsequently became the Mini Jem under Jeremy Delmar Morgan and a host of others as time went on. I never really found out what happened. I think they might have fallen out, Jem and Dizzy. So Jem went his own way. People think the Mini Jem was named after Jem Marsh. It wasn't. Jeremy Delmar Morgan was another Jeremy, and like Jem Marsh, he was known as Jem. So that's where that name came from. But the story of Marcos wouldn't be complete if we just covered a Mini Marcos. Came onto the price list in 1965. He liked Dizzy's concept very much, but disagreed with the plan, I think, to make it. I think Dizzy might have wanted it to make it a fully built, quite expensive product. But Jem thought it belonged as a kit, and that the body should be made from GRP rather than aluminium. He suggested it should be positioned, budget end of the market, really, I think. So Jem commissioned his friend Malcolm Newell, another maverick, who responsible for the two-wheeled car, the Quasar. He did the work, and he turned the original sort of dart concept that Jem was interested in into a Mini Marcos. Several variants and several custodians saw it end up back where it belonged, really, with Roy McMath as the Heritage Mark VI version, which I believe is still available. But anyway, if you've enjoyed that story, which I hope you have, it's quite a long one, this one, and I sort of apologise for that, but I sort of don't, because I think Jem deserves a proper bit of coverage. And I shall be very obliged, please, if you hit the like button if you've enjoyed it, and if you've enjoyed it and you stuck around and you haven't already done so, if you could consider subscribing, please, that would be great. That would help us really massively to develop the channel. And incidentally, we do these videos in association with Enwin Motors, Neil Winnington's channel. So if you could head over to Enwin Motors on YouTube and subscribe and like, that would be fantastic as well. In the meantime, wherever you are in the world, I wish you a great day. Thank you so much for giving up a little part of your day to visit us, our humble little channel. I hope you've enjoyed what you've heard, and I hope you come back and see us, or come back and visit us next time or another time. Until then, have a great day, and thank you.